Good morning. Welcome to KCPS Homeroom. My name is Paul Turner, Social Studies Coordinator for KC Public Schools. Today we're going to talk about the tensions rising in the colonies between the French and the English. Alright, what you need today is a pen and paper so we can get started. 1, 2, 3. Alright, today we're going to talk about the factors and the tensions led between the colonies in basically the new colonies. And we're going to talk about how we explain how contact with Europeans devastated Native American civilization with disease and aggression. You guys are going to get introduced to basically George Washington. Prior to basically the colonies setting up, the way that they did, the English colonies stopped basically east of the Appalachian Mountains. But they wanted to get west of the Appalachian Mountains to the Ohio River Valley. This is fertile land. This is great farming land. This is land basically that once the English controlled, they basically realized that they can get more money, more tax money from them, and they realized they can get more goods sent back to the old world. So we're going to get introduced to George Washington. This is Robert Denwiddle. Basically, he was the governor of Virginia. He sent George Washington, a 21-year-old captain. He sent him over to this area to deal with the French. It's the reason that George Washington loved Hamilton. Have you guys seen the film Hamilton? Or the play Hamilton, excuse me. Basically, this play, George Washington was reminded of himself in his youth when he dealt with Hamilton. So when he went over there, George Washington basically started a war at Fort Duquesne. This is the area where the war, they're already fighting the 7 Years' War over in Europe. This is the area where the French and Indian War started. So, 1754, 20-year-old George Washington and 150 men went to the Ohio River Valley. Washington attacked these French troops near Fort Duquesne. They killed the French leader. The French laid siege to Washington. Washington had to retreat with his men and a makeshift fort at Fort Necessity. Virginia surrendered. Again, this is that manly, that aura that George Washington had, right? This is what reminded Hamilton of himself in his youth. So, Washington's actions in Ohio Valley started the French and Indian War, a conflict basically that spread globally as the 7 Years' War. So, we say that World War I technically happened in the 20th century. Actually, World War was actually being fought right then during this time frame between the French and the English, alright? So, 1754, Intercontinental Congress was held in Albany, New York, to discuss uniting the colonies against this French threat. So, what came out of this? This slogan that you see today, join or die, right? This is basically all the colonies, all the chopped up snake, right? Imagine if that snake united. So, the Albany Plan failed to unite the colonies. It failed to secure basically help with the Iroquois tribes. The first Intercontinental Congress cooperation was discussed. This was led by Ben Franklin. The British sent General Edward Braddock, basically an inexperienced, poorly armed and soldiers, basically eased the French in their defeat. So, Braddock, he came over to basically recruit all these troops from the colonies. We're not America yet, we're going to call them the colonies, okay? So, British were defeated in a series of attacks on the wilderness fronts as the native forces, along with the frontier, joined the French effort. You remember, the French and the natives, basically they were like alliances system out there. You remember, if they switched over to Catholicism, these guys became part of the French citizens, correct? So, 3 years lasted. 3 years. 1757, William Pitt took control of the British effort and basically refocused the British attacks on Ohio Valley, from Ohio Valley to Quebec. So he knew going through Canada, if they could control the St. Lawrence River, they could basically win this war. So, Pitt took his efforts all the way up to Canada, and he focused on that effort. By 1758, the Louisburg fell to the British, opened up the St. Lawrence River to attack. By 1763, the Treaty of Paris gave Britain all of Canada. and the Ohio Valley, and almost the land east of the Mississippi River. So now, basically the British check out the French in North America. Great Britain became basically this preeminent power in the world, right? So what happens to the French in this new world? So Great Britain becomes this preeminent power in the world, right? Basically the undisputed greatest power, especially in North America. British basically victory in North America led to conflicts among the British government and American colonists going forward, along with the Native Americans, right? So this is the British crown. What happens to the French? So the colonists, they started growing basically, they had this huge aura of confidence about themselves. They fought along the British and basically they won a battle against the French. There's also a myth that the British basically were invincible. They realized that some of the British soldiers or the British generals that's coming over were poorly trained. So they started gaining more confidence in their abilities. So, William Pitt, his legacy in the United States, basically becomes Pittsburgh, right? So Pittsburgh is named after William Pitt. The colonists basically expanded their territory in North America. So, as Pitt's forces basically realized that North American territory is basically going to belong to the British, Wolfe scaled basically cliff protections back in Quebec. They met with French troops on a plane. Abraham then died in the battle, right? So now we have the British forces taking over North America. Again, when Montreal fell in 1760, by 1763, we had this huge Treaty of Paris. Again, the British forces basically now are the preeminent powers in the world. They're preeminent power in North America especially. So you see this territories, these are the original 13 colonies. They expanded. They expanded over basically west of the Appalachian Mountains. So now we have these colonists. They basically had this huge confidence, this huge aura. They started feeling mistreated basically by the British crown. These colonists were not loyal to the British crown. Remember this. Remember why did most people come over, right? Religious persecution, an opportunity to build wealth, basically a great sense of adventure. North America provided that for these colonists. So when that happened, basically they felt basically slighted and disrespected by the British crown. These forces started gaining this power of saying maybe we basically should be independent of basically the British crown. The British were frustrated with the colonists. They refused to fight and trade. They refused to fight, but they continued to trade with the French and Native American enemies, as they called them. The French and Indian War basically showed the colonists throughout the spectrum of the geography that the barriers of unity began melting away. They realized they had one common enemy. That common enemy is basically going to be the British crown. So, as we start advancing about 10 to 15 years going forward, we start seeing this dissent. We start seeing these colonists rebelling against this crown. They realized that their future lay within themselves. They realized that the British crown maybe didn't have their best interests laid ahead. So, let's go back to some of our questions that we asked in the beginning. I want you guys to answer. How did contact with Europeans devastated the Native American civilization due to disease and aggression? We already talked about the impact of the English coming over, how they treated them, right? We already talked about the way the French treated their Native American counterparts. They built an alliance system, correct? Now we can throw the aggression in. We can talk about the French and Indian War. Basically the impact that led. Basically taking over Native American lands. We're going to talk about Pontiac's rebellion basically in our next lecture. That's going to continue this whole process leading up to the basically American Revolution and basically America becoming its own colonies. So this is what I want you guys to do. While you guys are out there, I want you to basically start making some assumptions going forward. What happens 10 to 15 years down the road? What do you think happens basically to this sense of American society? Well, how about this colonial society? Do we have the sense of a national idea of who we are? Do we have this national culture? Or is it we still basically rule still these 13 little colonies by ourselves? My name is Paul Turner. I thank you for joining me with KCPS Homeroom. See you guys next week.